Thanks, Emily. Appreciate that. Hey, my name is Jeremy. I'm one of the pastors here at Port City. If I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, glad you guys are here. We are finishing up in the book of Ecclesiastes. We only have a couple more weeks left. So actually this week and then next week, Josh is going to be closing us out in chapter 12. Let me say this before we dive into our text for tonight. Let me just say thank you guys for rolling with the punches. I know that it's difficult when there's changes and switches and we're meeting in a different location at a different time. And I just want to say thank you guys so much for your ability to be flexible and to change and to adapt in that way. That means a lot to us as a church staff and as a team. And so we're just grateful for you guys that you're able to kind of roll with us in that way. And we're thankful that we have church partners like Bedford that are very willing and open to, give us this place to meet. So thank you guys, and thanks to Bedford Press as well. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and 11. There's a lot going on here, and so we're just going to kind of pick apart some of the things that Solomon is saying. But before we get into that, let me introduce you to Lawn Chair Larry. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Lawn Chair Larry. Lawn Chair Larry was a truck driver who, real person, he really existed. And Lawn Chair Larry had a real ambition in his life. He wanted to fly. Now, Larry was a truck driver, and in 1982, he took his flying ambitions, he took them and made them into a reality. The difference was he didn't necessarily have the money to purchase an airplane or to fly himself, nor did he have the money to get himself lessons. So what he did was he went out to Sears, and Lawn Chair Larry purchased a lawn chair for $109 and strapped a bunch of weather balloons to his lawn chair. And he thought, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to release these kind of weights on my lawn chair, and I'm going to, float up to about 100 feet in the air and just kind of survey over my neighborhood. But Lawn Chair Larry, he released the weights off of his lawn chair and shot up 16,000 feet. Immediately recognizing that he's in trouble. Now, he's a smart guy. So not only did he pack a few peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, okay, this is all true story. Not only did he pack himself a few peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, just in case something like that did happen and he was up there for an extended period of time, but he also packed with him a BB gun because he figured, well, if I get up there, I need somewhere to get down, and so I'll just shoot the weather balloons and slowly I'll make my way back down. And so he's up there for a while, actually gets picked up on radar. And he's kind of getting himself in a little bit of trouble. He's floating around, so he decides it's probably time to come down. And so he shoots several of the weather balloons kind of sequentially, and he floats back down. He's safe on the ground, but of course, it makes a big stink. And so you have all these people that are wanting to interview him. And I read one article, and they asked Larry, they said, Larry, why did you do that? Like, why did you do it? And I love his response. Larry says, you know what? I was tired of just sitting around. Here's what he says. He says, and I quote, "It was something that I had to do. I had this dream for 20 years. And if I hadn't done it, I think I would have ended up in the funny farm," is what he says. Now, we can look at Larry and we can laugh at that, and we can kind of make fun of Larry. But here's the thing we can't fault Larry for. We cannot fault Lawn Chair Larry for having some type of ambition and creating a plan and going after that plan. For actually having something in his life that is meaningful and purposeful to him and going after that. So we get to the end of Ecclesiastes, and that's essentially the question that Solomon is pushing us to. It gets very practical here at the end of this book. Because essentially what Solomon is doing at the end of Ecclesiastes is he's looking at every single one of us, and he is asking that same question. What is the plan that you have for your life? The question really for some of us is, do you have a plan for your life? What is it that you want to go after in life, and do you have a plan to get there? And Solomon is going to begin to outline how it is that we can actually have a life of meaning and purpose. So, just to kind of catch us up to speed in terms of where we're at in the book of Ecclesiastes. So we've said that one of the key phrases that we've come to in the book is that phrase, under the sun. You do not understand the entirety of the book of Ecclesiastes if you don't understand what Solomon is saying in terms of that phrase, under the sun. Because what Solomon has been doing is he has been analyzing every single thing that there is on the earth that is under the sun. He's been looking at work and pleasure and possessions and all of those things and saying, is there meaning, purpose, and ultimate satisfaction found in those things? And what Solomon has said is, whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, if you're simply looking at life under the sun, then it's vanity. It's meaningless. And what we've said every single week is that where Solomon is creating problems, or where Solomon is beginning to pose questions, what you realize is that the gospel layered on top of that answers those questions. So we have to understand Ecclesiastes through the lens of the gospel, because what we realize is that life is not simply lived under the sun. In order to find meaning and purpose in life, we have to see that there is actually something beyond the sun. There is hope, and Christ has come to give us that, and we see that in the gospel. And so there is something in our life that can make our life meaningful. We can find meaning in life, which also means that we can live a life on purpose and with a plan. So life under the sun, just to sum it up, is vain and meaningless. But life beyond the sun is deep and purposeful. So here's our big idea from this text today. The gospel compels us to pursue a life of meaning and purpose. The gospel compels us to live a life of both meaning and purpose. So, as we dive into this text here, what Solomon is going to give us is he's going to give us a few key ingredients. We'll call them that today. Some key ingredients as to how it is that we can actually find and develop a plan for our life where there is meaning and purpose. So the first one is simply this. Solomon says you need wisdom. If you want to live a life of deep meaning and purpose, if you're trying to develop a plan for your life, then you want this plan to involve a meaningful life, a purposeful life, one that is compelled by the gospel. One of the things that you need to get is you need wisdom. Now, a few things that we need to remember about wisdom. The first thing about wisdom is that wisdom is not ultimate. Solomon has already told us this earlier in the book of Ecclesiastes. What Solomon says, hey, wisdom is good, but don't forget, wisdom is not ultimate. Jesus is ultimate. That's what we see through the gospel. And so we can get wisdom, but it's not the end all. So we want wisdom, but it's not an ultimate thing. The other thing about wisdom, in terms of how we can define it, is wisdom is defined simply as living life by God's design. So when we say wisdom, pursuing wisdom, what we mean by that is we mean pursuing life in the way that God has designed it. All right, so remember those few things when we talk about wisdom. But here's what Solomon says. Let's go back to verse 1. Emily didn't read this part, but I want to go back and read this real quick. Chapter 10, verse 1 says this, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense. And he says to everyone that he is a fool. So when we think about wisdom, and Solomon's saying that you need wisdom to pursue a life of purpose and meaning, a few things I want to mention about wisdom. First is, wisdom is living life with intentionality. There's intentionality to our life if we are living a life pursuing wisdom. Solomon is noting here that our propensity is towards folly. That's why he says there, a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. What he is saying there is there's no neutrality. If you let your hand off the wheel, you are going to slide into folly. So you're either pursuing wisdom intentionally with a plan, or you are slipping into folly. And he gives us both a warning here to show us how this is the case, as well as an example. So verse 1 is essentially a warning. What Solomon is talking about when he's talking about flies and in ointment, what he is saying there is he's saying it takes far less to ruin something than it does to create it. Another way to translate that would just be, it's easier to make a stink than it is to create a sweetness. That's what Solomon is saying in verse 1. So what that means is not being intentional in your life, whatever area of your life that may be, your marriage, your finances, your friendships, your hobbies, whatever, your parenting, not being intentional. Solomon says if you're not, then don't be surprised when those areas of your life are a mess. Because when we take our hands off the wheel, he says, we tend towards folly. He says, how do I know this? Well, look at verse 18. He says, well, let me give you an example. Look at verse 18. He says, through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. What is Solomon saying there? He's pointing out the rules of entropy. He's basically saying that all things tend toward disorder. That if you're not working on something, if you're not actively pursuing it, if you're not working on it, it's going to fall apart. Just look at your house. Okay? You know that to be true if you just kind of go away for 2 weeks and you come back and you're like, how did this happen? Like, how did all these weeds grow and how did that break? You know, Solomon is just using a practical example to show us that if we're not living intentionally in this way, that we will tend towards folly. And so Solomon says in verse 2, this is the way of the fool. He says the fool goes to the left. A better way to translate that would be to the fool goes astray. So if we're thinking about this idea of intentionality, then I think the question of intentionality is this. Who are you in your life trying to become? Like, who are you trying to become? I thought about it this past week. I was rewatching the memorial service for Pastor Tim Keller. If you guys are familiar with Tim Keller, he pastors a church. It's really not a Port City sermon unless I quote Tim Keller, so you better get familiar with him. But Tim Keller pastored a church in New York City for many years. He pastored also in Virginia. And it was really interesting. As I was watching the memorial service, and I actually just finished reading his biography, one of the things that stuck out in his biography and his memorial service, he was a brilliant individual. Pastored a mega church in New York City, reached thousands and thousands of people all over the world for Christ. But the one thing that people kept saying over and over and over again was that he was a man of character. His character was the thing that people remembered him most for. And as I'm watching and reading, I'm thinking, that's who I want to become. Like, that's the type of person that I want to be as I grow up and as I get older. Realizing as I'm saying that doesn't happen on accident. That you don't become a person of character simply by sitting back. One of the exercises that I found so helpful, there was a book that came out several years ago, a long time ago, by a guy named Stephen Covey, a leadership book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the exercises that Covey talks about in that book is he says, write your own obituary. Because one of the things that Covey realizes is that when you face the reality of death, it forces you to think about who you want to be in life. It's one of the reasons why Solomon faced death and talked about it last week in Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Because if we can't face the reality of death, then we never actually wrestle with who do we want to become in this life. And that question of who you're trying to become, it doesn't happen on accident. And so if you are not actively pursuing depth and meaning in your life, in response to the overwhelming grace that we find in the gospel, you will slide into shallow meaninglessness. You can say it this way, our default in this life, our default is not depth and meaning. Our default is ease and comfort. So that's the first thing that he says about wisdom. Wisdom is living with intentionality, but then he goes on to say, well, wisdom is also living with patience. Look at verse 4. Chapter 10, verse 4, he says, If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offense to rest. There Solomon is pointing out that it's the fool who, when he gets angry, maybe even justifiably angry, he doesn't hang around to resolve the conflict. What the fool does is he rushes off in a big huff. I thought about when I was in college, when I was in university, one of the things I did every summer is I worked maintenance for the school where my dad worked. And I remember one day, one of the things that we would do every single summer is that we would kind of clean up in order for the teachers to kind of get prepared for the next year. And so we would help move things out of their classroom. And one year, what we were doing is we were cleaning up all these old bookshelves. They were getting a bunch of new bookshelves in. I don't even remember why. Okay, I was 20 years old. I don't remember why I was upset. But for whatever reason, I was upset at this task that I was given, okay? And my boss had said, hey, you need to load these bookshelves up in my truck and you need to take them back to the dumpster. Again, I don't remember why I was upset, but I was going to show them that I was upset. And so I hop into his truck with all these bookshelves. He's made of composite wood. And I peel off because I'm like, I'm going to show them. Every single one of those bookshelves came flying out of the truck and smashed all over the driveway in about 100 different pieces. And here I am, now having to spend the next 2 hours picking up the pieces of this bookshelf while everyone walks past me. And Solomon says, that's the fool. The fool, in his anger, he rushes off in a huff. The fool is reactive. Something upsets the fool, and instead of staying and dealing with it and handling it, they run off in a fit of rage. So he says not only does wisdom living with intentionality, he says wisdom is living with patience, but then he says wisdom is living with the facts of life. It's being realistic about the realities of life. Here's what he says in verse 8. Look back at verse 8. He says, he who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. Translation, here's what Solomon is saying. Life is unpredictable. That's what he's saying there. Life is unpredictable. So what he's doing is he's using a few different examples. He's saying, okay, look, generally, if someone is doing something wrong, so he uses the illustration of someone digging a pit or breaking through a wall. Digging a pit in biblical times, usually that was something that was kind of more of a nefarious act, something that someone was doing in order to try to trap somebody. And so what he's saying is, look, if someone digs a pit, they're trying to do something that they shouldn't be doing. I mean, hey, they're going to fall into it. Generally, if someone is doing something wrong, they get what's coming to them. Solomon says, not always. But then he uses a positive example. He says, well, what about the person who's quarrying stones? They're someone who's doing honest work. Well, even sometimes when someone's doing honest work, they get hurt. Solomon is saying, look, life is unpredictable. What that means is that wisdom is not about trying to control life or to control the situations around you. Wisdom is living with a conscious awareness that life is unpredictable, but the one thing that is predictable is the fact that God is sovereign over all the situations of your life. So wisdom is the recognition that you're not in control. So it begs the question this afternoon, are there situations in your life right now where you are sensing full well that you are not in control? Maybe there's situations in your life right now that are not going the exact way that you thought that they would go or the way that you think that they should go. And Solomon is saying it's the fool who tries to take that and try to control that and try to manipulate that situation in their life. It's the wise person that realizes that at the end of the day, God's in control of all of it. So wisdom is living with the realities of life. But then lastly, he says wisdom is living with care. Specifically here, he's saying living with care in the way that we speak. So look at chapter 10, verse 12. He says, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. There's actually a better translation for that. What it really should say is that the words of the wise man are full of grace. That they give grace to the hearer. This is in a lot of ways what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, a verse that we quote a lot in our house. And Paul says in Ephesians 4:29, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such is as good for building up as fits the occasion. And here's what Paul says. He says that it may give grace to those who hear. That's the words of a wise person. The words of a wise person give grace. The fool's words get him in trouble. When I was doing work with university students, one of the things that we would do every single summer, we did an 8-week-long summer project. And the summer project always began with us taking the students to New York City. And we would take them to New York City to work with a ministry there. And primarily it was to kind of help them get some experience sharing the gospel in a context that was very different than their own. Now, most of these students were from smaller towns in the South. And so when we got to New York, we always had to kind of lay the ground rules. And we said, look, we know you guys are university students, and so, you're adults, but you're in New York City, okay? And so there's a few things that we need to establish. If you want to go out, make sure that you just let us know where you're going, and make sure you take someone with you. And so one day, we're sitting around, me and one of the other pastors, and we're sitting around, and we have a student that comes up to us, and he just needs to run up the street to CVS. That's our version of Shoppers Drug Mart, right? He wants to go over to CVS to get something. We said, okay, Ben, that's no big deal. Just make sure you grab someone. Well, Ben begins to launch into about a 3-minute speech to tell us why he, as a 21-year-old male, does not need someone to go with him to the store. And so we sit there and we listen to him, just words and words and words and words. And finally, me and KJ, the other pastor, we say, you know what, Ben? All right, fine. We're not going to argue with you. You go on ahead. 4 hours later, we realize that we hadn't heard from Ben. And so we begin to ask some of the other students, hey, have you heard from Ben? Well, what happened was Ben walks out. Literally, you go 2 blocks up the street and you make a left and the store is right there. Ben comes out of the store, and instead of going right, Ben goes left. Now he finds himself lost for 3 hours in Queens, New York. Needless to say, when we picked him up in the minivan, he didn't have a whole lot to say at that point. Solomon says the words of a wise person brings grace, but the fool's words get him in trouble. He says this in verse 14. He says, a fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? Here's what Solomon means there. He says the fool seldom listens to what others have to say, but they most often assume that everyone is listening to what they say. So we just need to pause real quick when we think about this. Let's just take inventory of the words in our life from this last week. Like if we were just to take inventory of the words that came out of our mouth this last week, what would it reveal? Like Jesus says in Matthew chapter 12, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. What would an inventory of the words in our life reveal about what we believe about God's grace and mercy? If our words are meant to give grace to those who hear, what do our words from this past week, whether it's in the way that we spoke around our coworkers, or whether it's in the way that we were disciplining our children, in the way that we argued with our spouse, what do our words reveal about what we believe about God's grace and mercy? So Solomon says, be careful with your words. Wisdom is living with care. So the first ingredient, Solomon says, if you want to live a life of meaning and purpose, go get wisdom. But then he continues on. Look in chapter 11, verse 1. He says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8. For you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. It sounds like a riddle. You're like, I don't. And he says, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. What exactly is Solomon getting at here? I think he's giving us another ingredient for living a purposeful, meaningful life, and that is courage. He's saying you got to be bold in your life. There needs to be courage. And so what he's saying here is, he's saying it's better to launch out and fail than to hug all of your resources tightly. That's what he means when he says casting your bread upon the waters. But then he says, furthermore, it's not about waiting until the conditions are right. He says it's about launching out and acting, but not doing that when you think that everything is exactly the way that it should be. Solomon is saying, don't sit around waiting for what could be. Grapple with what actually is and then act. Do something. I think about our culture. I just think about how risk averse our culture is to things that are of real meaning and purpose. I wouldn't say that our culture is necessarily risk averse. I mean, there's all kinds of shows that are built around that idea of risk. I'm talking about things of like deep meaning and purpose. So let's just take one example. Okay, for instance, this is kind of an easy one to target. Okay, the idea of cohabitation, where you have a guy and a girl who say, you know what, we're in a relationship together, and in order for us to know whether or not this relationship is going to work, certainly in order to know whether or not we should marry one another, we need to move in together. Because in order to know and be sure, we got to test it out. Essentially, we have to play house before we can actually build a house. You look at something like that, and you're like, no, that's not meaningful and purposeful. That's just hedging your bet. That's just playing it safe. The gospel's formula for us in terms of living a meaningful and purposeful life, it's not hedging your bet, it's losing your life. That's what Jesus says. Remember what we talked about in our series in Luke? What did Jesus say so pointedly in Luke 9? For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, he'll save it. This is why John Piper says, and I think he's so right, when he says, risk is right. Risk is right. Think about these different stories, these different events in the Bible where I think you can just kind of see this particular attribute for a meaningful, purposeful life lived out. I mean, you just kind of go all throughout like the Old Testament and the New Testament. You see, well, one of the stories I read this week, a familiar story, whether you grew up in church or not. In fact, you probably know this story if you never ever actually went to church before, the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. You think about the story of David and Goliath. You think about David, who at that point in the story, he had just recently been anointed as future king of Israel, but he's still a shepherd boy. And David is out in the flock, and he comes to order to give his brothers provision, some food, as they're fighting against the Philistines. The Philistines are the enemies of Israel. And here he comes, and as he's walking into the Israelites' camp, he hears this guy from across the way, a Philistine giant, someone that the Bible says is over 9 feet tall. He's taunting not just Israel, but he's taunting Israel's God. He's taunting the one true God. And all the Israelites, they're afraid, and David is confused. He's like, I don't understand. How is it that you're letting this guy taunt our God? And so David says, I'm going to do something about it. And so they try to, form David, they put him into all this military gear, and David says, no, I don't need that. David goes out with a sling and some stones, and he defeats the giant. We know that story. We've read it. Here's what oftentimes happens when we read stories like that. One of the things you miss the fact that in that story, God never guaranteed to David that he would go out and he would defeat the giant. Like, there's nowhere in 1 Samuel 17 where you go back and you read it and you're like, No. What we do is we read the end into it because we know the end. David didn't know the end. Here's the thing, what he did know. He knew the God who held the end. So what you see is what Jenny Allen says. Jenny Allen, author and speaker, she says, obedient risk fast tracks growth. Risk causes you to want God, listen, because you know you need God when you're scared. Some of us have this false assumption that we can't, whatever that may be, fill in the blank. No, we can't share the gospel. That we can't maybe, give generously in the way that God is calling us to. We can't commit to a local church. We can't, I don't know, whatever it is, fill in the blank. We think, man, I can't do that because I'm not spiritually mature, because the situation is not right. The problem is oftentimes we actually have it backwards. We think that we can't do that because we're stuck in our Christian life. The problem is that we're actually stuck in our Christian life because we haven't lived and risked obediently in the way that God has called us. So living this way, it involves a couple of things. If living a meaningful, purposeful life involves boldness and courage, how is it that we get that? Do we just turn around and say to each other, like, hey, you need to be more courageous? No, that doesn't work. That doesn't last. One of the first things that we see is, again, going back to this idea, is that courage recognizes that you're not in control of your life. Solomon tells us again, look in verse 5, chapter 11, verse 5, he says, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning, sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper. This or that, whether both alike will be good. Some of us have a hard time stepping out in courage because we feel like we need to know the end. Solomon is saying here, there's most things in your life, you're not going to know how it turns out. We're not in control. But here's the other thing. Here's the other way that we can step out and trust to God. Is realizing that in the gospel tells us that God's love for you is not contingent upon how obedient or not obedient you are. The gospel tells us that God's love for you is contingent upon Jesus. Not because of any risk or non-risk that you take for God. So here's what that means. That means that risk is right because our salvation is not contingent upon the results. Your salvation, God does not love you because you stepped out and whatever it is you stepped out in, it succeeded or not. So take, for example, sharing the gospel. Some of us will say, man, I don't know if I can share the gospel. What happens if I do that with my family member or my friend? And as a result of that, they don't want a relationship with me anymore. They don't like me anymore. They don't want to hang out with me anymore. So we don't risk it because we're afraid of the results. And what you see here in the gospel is that it's okay. Not only is your salvation not contingent upon the results, but risk is right because your identity and your worth are not contingent upon the results. See how freeing that is? The fact that God's love for you is not contingent upon how risky or courageous you live life or how not risky or courageous you live life. What that does is it actually frees you to live that way. I mean, just think about if you were going into your workplace and you feel like you had an idea that was a really good idea, but you know that your boss is a really difficult person who does not handle failure really well. And so for so long, you've just been saying, I just can't, I don't want to propose this idea because I'm afraid that my boss, if this doesn't work out, they're gonna fire me. What if you walk in knowing that whatever idea you propose, your boss is going to say, you know what, do it. Go for it. It doesn't matter what the results are. In an infinitely and an eternal greater way, that's what we have in the gospel. Because Christ has already won on our behalf, that we can step out in obedience, knowing that the results of whatever we do is not contingent upon, or God's love for us is not contingent upon that. So here's the question then. What is it that God is calling you to do to step out in terms of obedience? If we have that freedom, and because of the gospel we can walk in that freedom, what is it today that God is calling you to walk in? Maybe it's community. Maybe you've just said, you know what, I don't want to risk being vulnerable around other people. I don't know if I want to do it. You know, you guys have talked a lot about being in a group and going to a group, and I know it's something that I need to do. I can't risk it. I can't risk putting myself in relationship with other people where I might get hurt. Maybe that's the risk that God is calling you to take. Maybe it's like we just said, maybe it's sharing Jesus with someone in your life. You know that God has put you in someone's life. Maybe it's the person that's sitting across from you in the cubicle. Maybe it's the person that is in your family. I don't know, whoever it may be. You know that God has put that person in your life in order for you to share Christ. And maybe you've just said, I don't know I can do it. Or maybe it's simply just following Jesus. Maybe you've been on this kind of journey of faith where you've been kind of circling Jesus for weeks and weeks and months, and you're like, I just don't know that I can do it. What is it that God is calling you to step out in courage, knowing that because of Christ, that God's love for you, His concern for you, His care for you does not change? One of the things that we say here, oftentimes, just reiterate, is this, that good intention Christianity is still disobedient Christianity. So Solomon says, in order to live a life of meaning and purpose, not only do we need wisdom, we need courage. But then the last thing is this. Look at verse 7. Chapter 11, verse 7. We'll close with this. He says, light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth. And let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. But know that for all of these things, God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and dawn of life are vanity. So wisdom, courage, and the last thing is joy. How is it that we pursue a life of meaning and purpose? Solomon says that we pursue it with joy. So a few things that Solomon brings out here. What does a life of joy look like? First, he says a life of joy is a life of thankfulness. We've said this a lot in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's being thankful. Here's why we're thankful. We said, look, if you're just simply looking at life under the sun, then it's meaningless. But when you realize that life is lived to be way more beyond that, or life is lived more than that is beyond the sun, then you can actually be thankful for the gifts that God has given us. Under the sun, meaningless. When you realize that there's life beyond the sun, you can be thankful for the many gifts that God has given us. And Solomon says life itself is a gift. Life is sweet. He says just like walking outside on a sunny day, right? Think about just the sun coming out right now. Walking outside and not seeing the sun for 24, 36 hours. There's a part of us that it's sweet. I thought about it this week. We were down on the waterfront. I think it was Tuesday night. And my wife and I were just kind of surprised at how busy it was down the waterfront. And I realized it was busy because, as you get closer to the end of the summer, Nova Scotians, what we tend to do is we tend to try to, enjoy as much of the sun as possible because we know that there's a season coming where we won't see the sun for an extended period of time, And so that's what Solomon is saying. He's saying, hey, life is short. Life is fleeting. Just like summer is here in Nova Scotia, enjoy it while it lasts. It's a gift. Be thankful for it. Again, he's giving us this helpful perspective. He's saying it doesn't last forever. I know that's hard to imagine when you're 15 years old and you look out at life and you think that all of life, you have all these possibilities, and you kind of look out and you think, man, what am I going to do? There's so much of life to live, and then all of a sudden life begins to happen, and the next thing you look up and like life is kind of over. I thought about this, I've thought about this a lot, just how fast life goes. It's very similar to one of my first skiing experiences. I had just learned how to ski. And I remember my friends convincing me to go down a black diamond. And of course, I was a teenager, so I thought, of course, like I'm an expert. I've skied twice, so why wouldn't I? And I remember, we get started, and I think, well, this is okay. I'm just kind of taking these like wide turns. I'm like, this is not bad at all. And then I remember coming to the point of that hill where it just kind of goes like that. And I'm not sure what happened, but I was at the bottom. And I remember like looking back up, and my friends coming over like, are you okay? And we're like looking over my body to make sure like I still have both my legs. And I think about something like that, I'm thinking, man, isn't that life? Where all of a sudden we find ourselves at the bottom, we look back up and we're like, what happened? Solomon is saying that's true. That's how life is. Life is fleeting. It's fast. So the question then becomes, how are we actively cultivating thankfulness for those moments in our life right now? As life passes by quickly, how are we looking at life and saying, these are the moments that God, the creator of our life, has given us. And these are the ways that we want to be thankful. That's how you curate joy in your life. Solomon says, not only do you need to be thankful, he says you need to be present. Be present in the seasons and in the days. One of my favorite authors, Mark Sayers, he says, because of the digital and globalized and networked world in which we live, he says we're both everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. It's very difficult for us to be present Not just in the day-to-day. Certainly it's hard in the day-to-day, whether it's because of our screens, our phones, whatever it may be. It's hard to be present in the day, but it's also hard to be present in the seasons of life. And so Solomon comes along and he's giving a word to the youthful. He's giving a word to those who are younger. I am not in any way going to define what age that is. Okay, I'm going to let you define, okay, what youthful means. But here's the message that Solomon says to those of us who are younger. He says, don't give in to the lie that life will be so much better when. Be present in the season that you're in. How easy it is to be in the season of life where you think, it'll be so much better when I'm out of this house. It'll be so much better when I get into university. It'll be so much better when I get a job. It'll be so much better when I'm on my own. It'll be so much better when I have it, whatever it may be. Solomon's saying, don't do that. Enjoy youth. Be present. But then he says to those of us who are no longer youthful, and I'll put myself in that category. I remember the day that I knew that I was no longer a youth. Some guys had convinced me. I'd played baseball through university, but some guys had convinced me to play well after I should have been playing. And so we're playing in a community league, and I remember I hit the ball, and I got about 10 steps towards first base, and I had the realization, I'm not going to make it to first base without falling down. And I fell down, and everyone got quiet, and I got up slowly, and I walked to the dugout, and I never played an inning of baseball again in my life. That was the day that youthfulness ended for me. That was it. It was over. And Solomon says, for those of us who are no longer youthful, don't idolize youth. If you are in that younger demographic, he's saying, hey, enjoy the season that you're in. If you're not, he says, don't idolize it. So here's the problem. Some of us, we're too busy trying to recapture youth that we're not intentionally pouring into the actual youth. We're trying to live life as if we're still 18. Solomon says, don't do that. We're trying to still be youthful instead of giving them what they lack, which is wisdom, godliness. So parents, what does that look like in your home? How does that look like as you're interacting with your kids? What does that look like for us as a church? For those of us that maybe don't fall into that youthful category anymore, that does not mean that there's not a place for us to pour into those that are. But there's a ton of life experience and wisdom that we have, and Solomon says, don't waste that. There's people in your life and in this church that need that. The last thing that Solomon says in terms of how do you live a life of joy, he says not only do you need to be thankful, not only do you need to be present, but he says you need to be repentant. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because Josh is actually going to preach basically a whole sermon on this next week. Because the last ingredient to living a life of meaning and purpose, Solomon says in the whole conclusion of the book, it's to be godly. Fear God and obey what he says. So it's no surprise here that what Solomon says in verse 10 is pushing us in that direction. So here's what Solomon says. Look back at verse 10 in chapter 11. He says, remove vexation and pain. What's interesting is if you actually look at a better translation of the word pain, it actually means evil. He says, remove vexation and evil. Remove sin from your life. Which makes sense because what you realize is that joy and sin cannot coexist. You cannot be actively living in sin and experiencing joy in your life. I remember one of the first times when I was little that I realized that if you turn magnets around, they actually repel one another. You kind of had that realization, and as a kid, you began to just kind of see how you could push the magnet across the desk or whatever it may be. I think about that visual, and I think that's the visual that Solomon wants us to have when it comes to joy and sin. That sin will repel joy in your life. That there are some of us in here where we are struggling to find joy. And there's a number of reasons why that exists, but there is one thing that it could be. It could be that there's unrepentant sin in your life. Because if there's unrepentant sin in your life, one of the things you'll realize is it's really hard to live a joy-filled life. So Solomon's pushing us here. As we think about closing out in this series, he's wanting us to realize if you want to live a life of meaning and purpose, it involves godliness, and godliness starts with repentance. So is there something that God is calling you to repent of, to remove sin in your life? Is there maybe some type of resentment or somebody that you have been holding forgiveness from for a long period of time? Is there some type of hidden sin or hidden addiction in your life? Is there spirit of discontentment? Is there some type of coveting that goes on? As you're scrolling through social media, you just kind of find you have a ongoing, unrepentant spirit of covetousness. Maybe it's explosive or undealt with anger. Is there sin that you need to remove in your life if you want to truly experience the joy that God has to offer? Proverbs 1, which also was written by Solomon, he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you want to live a life of meaning and purpose, where does it begin? It begins with the fear of the Lord. What we have to realize is that in our sin, we live as fools. But here's the good news. Christ came so that we did not have to die as fools. So Paul says, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you have been so good to us, so kind and so gracious. God, I thank you that, Father, we can look to the cross and we know that you are not only loving and kind, but Father, then we see the resurrection. You're powerful. So God, we do pray that we would measure your love for us by the cross and your power to at work in our life by the resurrection. God, we badly want to live a life of meaning and purpose, but we know, Father, we need you through the power of your Holy Spirit to do that. And God, we know, God, that we can't do that apart from Christ. So, Father, I do pray for those that maybe for the last several weeks have been with us and they've been wrestling with what does a life of meaning and purpose look like. God, would you show them it begins with submission to Christ and the lordship of Him over their life. God, please reveal that to them. God, if there are areas of our life, God, where we are maybe taking our hands off the wheel, would you convict us, Father, where we are sliding back into folly? God, we need you desperately to help us to live a life of wisdom and courage and joy. God, we need you. We pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen.